Hi, I'm Bob Stine, and I'd like to tell you about the dice game. It's one of the examples that we have in our book to try to illustrate how random variables come to life when you talk about them in interesting problems. If you're lucky, you have 3 of these dice that come with the book. The dice are special. They come in 3 colors. There's a red, a green, and a white die. And instead of having little dots on the faces, they have numbers instead. We use these dice in a simulation we call the dice game to illustrate the nature of means and variances when you talk about how investments perform over time. Let me focus on one of the dice. This is the green die. If you look at the faces, you'll see that they have numbers like 1.1, 1.2, 1.4, 0.8, and 0.9. What those values on the faces of the die represent are how an investment performs. So if you roll the green die, and here I just rolled a 1.2, that says if I started off this period with $100 in this investment, I suddenly now have $120 in this investment. And so if you keep rolling it, I get a 1.1, so it went up another 10%. I roll it again. I got a 0.8 this time, which means I lost 20% of my investment. Now, what's interesting about the die, and you can keep rolling it and rolling it, is it tells you how this investment performs over time. You can look at the white die and the red die, and you'll see that they're pretty different from the green die. The green die has values that are sort of varying around 1. The white die has, in fact, 4 values at 1. The red die is kind of an interesting one because it has 3 threes, which means your investment triples in value when you roll half the time. The red one, just to keep it interesting, also has a value, let's see if I can find it here, 0.05, which means it loses 95% of its value 1/6 of the time. So when we're teaching the concepts of probability and random variables to students, we use these dice to simulate random variables. How it works then in the dice game is you take all 3 dice and you imagine that you have, say, $100 or $1,000 in these investments. You roll all 3 dice and you see how the investments perform. And you do this over and over and over again. And after about 20 times, you get to see how the investments turn out. Usually what will happen in this game is green turns out well. Red turns out to be exciting, but usually crashes, and white doesn't really go anywhere. What's interesting about the game is we didn't just make up these numbers. The green die actually simulates the U.S. stock market. In other words, it has the same mean and variance, this random variable, as a random variable defined from historic returns on the U.S. market. The white die, that's basically treasury bonds, and here the red die is basically a stock that we made up that has huge amounts of volatility. So it's an interesting game. It's fun to play with the students, and after this example, they really get interested in what these properties of random variables are, because we use those properties of random variables to anticipate how this experiment would turn out without ever having to roll the dice at all. So you could actually tell how this was going to turn out ahead of time if you knew about calculating means and standard deviations of random variables. So it's an interesting experiment. It brings random variables and probabilities to life, and it's connected with important business decisions about how I trade off risk versus return. For example, our red die here, it's obviously going to be a very risky investment. How should I compare it to the green die? Take a look at the example. It's in the book. There's also a paper in the American Statistician that talks about it called Being Warren Buffett. Hope you enjoy it. Thanks.